13th tribe, the Khazar Empire, and its heritage. Among other Hebrew sources, there is the Cambridge document, so called after its present location in the Cambridge University Library. It was discovered at the end of the last century, together with other priceless documents in the Cairo Geniza, the storeroom of an ancient synagogue, by the Cambridge scholar Solomon Chetzer. The document is in a bad state. It is a letter, or a copy of a letter, consisting of about 100 lines in Hebrew. The beginning and the end are missing, so that it is impossible to know who wrote it and to whom it was addressed. King Joseph is mentioned in it as a contemporary and referred to as my lord. Khazaria is called our land. So the most plausible inference is that the letter was written by a Khazar Jew of King Joseph's court in Joseph's lifetime. That it is roughly contemporaneous with the Khazar correspondence. Some authorities have further suggested that it was addressed to Hasidi ibn Shaprut and handed in Constantinople to Hasidi's unsuccessful envoy, Isaac Bar Nathan, who brought it back to Cordoba, whence it found its way to Cairo when the Jews were expelled from Spain. At any rate, internal evidence indicates that the document originated not later than in the 11th century, and more likely in Joseph's lifetime in the 10th. It contains another legendary account of the conversion, but its main significance is political. The writer speaks of an attack on Khazaria by the Alans, attacking under Byzantine instructions, under Joseph's father, Aaron the Blessed. No other Greek or Arab sources seem to mention this campaign, but there is a significant passage in Constantine Porphyrogenitius de Administrado Imperio, written in 947 through 50, which leads some credibility to the unknown letter writer's statements. Concerning Khazaria, how war is to be made upon them, and by whom. As the Guz are able to make war on the Khazars, being near them, so likewise the rule of Alana, because the Nile of climate of Khazaria, the fertile region north of the Caucasus, are close to Alana, and the Altan can, if he wishes, raid them and cause great damage and distress to the Khazars from that quarter. Now, according to Joseph's letter, the ruler of Elan paid tribute to him, and whether in fact he did or not, his feelings towards the Kagan were probably much the same as the Bulgar kings. The passage in Constantine revealing his efforts to incite the Alans to war against the Khazars ironically reminds one of Ibn Fadlan's mission with a parallel purpose. Evidently, the days of the Byzantine Khazar rapprochement were long past in Joseph's time, but I am anticipating later developments to be discussed in Chapter 3. About a century after the Khazar correspondence and the presumed date of the Cambridge document, Yehuda Halevi wrote his once celebrated book, Kuzari, the Khazars. Halevi, who lived 1085 to 1141, is generally considered the greatest Hebrew poet of Spain. The book, however, was written in Arabic and translated later into Hebrew. Its subtitle is The Book of Proof and Arguments in Defense of the Despised Faith. Halevi was a Zionist who died on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Kuzari, written a year before his death, is a psycho-sophistical tract propounding the view that the Jewish nation is the sole mediator between God and the rest of mankind. At the end of history, all other nations will be converted to Judaism, and the conversion of the Khazars appears as a symbol or a token of that ultimate event. In spite of its title, the tract has little to say about the Khazar country itself, which serves mainly as a backdrop for yet another legendary account of the conversion. The king, the angel, the Jewish scholar, etc. And for the philosophical and theological dialogues between the king and the protagonist of the three religions. However, there are a few factual references which indicate that Halevi had either read the correspondence between Hasidi and Joseph or had other sources of information about the Khazar country. Thus, we are informed that after the appearance of the angel, the king of the Khazars revealed the secret of his dream to the general of his army. And the general also looms larger later on. Another obvious reference to the dual rule of Kagan and Beck. Halevi, he also mentions the histories and books of the Khazars, which reminds one of Joseph speaking of our archives, where documents of state are kept. Lastly, Halevi, twice in different places of the book, gives the date of the conversion as having taken place 400 years ago, and in the year 4500, according to the Jewish calendar. This points to AD 740, which is the most likely date. All in all, it is a poor harvest as far as factual statements are concerned, from a book that enjoyed immense popularity among the Jews of the Middle Ages. But the medieval mind was less attracted by fact than by fable, and the Jews were more interested in the date of the coming of the Messiah than in geographical data. The Arab geographers and chroniclers had a similar cavalier attitude to distances, dates, and the frontiers between fact and fancy. This also applies to the famed German Jewish traveler Rabbi Petachi of Ratisbon, who visited Eastern Europe and Western Asia between 1170 and 1185. His travelogue, Sibab Ha'olam, Journey Around the World, was apparently written by a pupil based on his notes or on dictations. It relates how shocked the good rabbi was by the primitive observances of the Khazar Jews north of the Crimea, which he attributed to their adherence to the Karaite heresy. And the Rabbi Pedici asked them, "Why do you not believe in the word of the sages, the Talmudists?" They replied, "Because our fathers did not teach them to us." On the eve of the Sabbath, they cut all the bread which they eat on the Sabbath. They eat it in the dark and sit the whole day on one spot. Their prayers consist only of their palms. So incensed was the rabbi that when he subsequently crossed the Khazar heartland, all he had to say was that it took him 8 days, during which he heard the wailing of women and the barking of dogs. He does mention, however, that while he was in Baghdad, he had seen envoys from the Khazar kingdom looking for needy Jewish scholars from Mesopotamia and even from Egypt to teach their children Torah and Talmud. While few Jewish travelers from the West undertook the hazardous journey to the Volga, they recorded encounters with Khazar Jews at all principal centers of the civilized world. Rabbi Pedici met them in Baghdad. Benjamin of Tudela, another famous traveler of the 12th century, visited Khazar notables in Constantinople and Alexandria. Abraham ben Dad, a contemporary of Judah Halevi, reports that he had seen in Toledo some of their descendants, pupils of the wise. Tradition has it that these were Khazar princes. One is tempted to think of Indian princelings sent to Cambridge to study. Yet there is curious ambivalence in the attitude towards the Khazars of the leaders of Orthodox Jewry in the East, centered on the Talmudic Academy in Baghdad. The Gaon, Hebrew for excellency, who stood at the head of the academy, was the spiritual leader of the Jewish settlements dispersed all over the Near and Middle East, while the Exilarch, or Prince of Captivity, represented the secular power over these more or less autonomous communities. Saadia Gaon, 882 to 942, most famous among the spiritual excellences, who left voluminous writings, repeatedly refers in them to the Khazars. He mentions a Mesopotamian Jew who went to Khazaria to settle there as if this were an everyday occurrence. He speaks obscurely of the Khazar court. Elsewhere he explains that in the biblical expression Hiram of Tyre, Hiram is not a proper name, but a royal title, like Caliph for the ruler of the Arabs, and Kagan for the king of the Khazars. Thus, Khazaria was very much on the map, in the literal and metaphorical sense, for the leaders of the ecclesiastical hierarchy of ordinary Jewry. But at the same time, the Khazars were regarded with certain misgivings, both on racial grounds and because of their suspected leanings towards the Karaite heresy. One 11th century Hebrew author, Japheth ibn Ali, himself a Karaite, explains the word mamzer, bastard, by the example of the Khazars who became Jews without belonging to the race. His contemporary, Jacob ben Reuben reflects the opposite side of this ambivalent attitude by speaking of the Khazars as a single nation who do not bear the yoke of the exile, but are great warriors paying no tribute to the Gentiles. In summing up the Hebrew sources on the Khazars that have come down to us, one senses a mixed reaction of enthusiasm, skepticism, and, above all, bewilderment. A warrior nation of Turkish Jews must have seemed to the rabbis as strange as a circumcised unicorn. During 1,000 years of dispersion, the Jews had forgotten what it was like to have a king and a country. The Messiah was more real to them than the Kagan. As a postscript to the Arab and Hebrew sources relating to the conversion, it should be mentioned that the apparently earliest Christian source antedates them both. At some date earlier than 864, the Westphalian monk Christian Druthmar of Aquitania wrote a Latin treatise, Expositio in Evangelizium Mattel, in which he reports that there exist people under the sky in regions where no Christians can be found, whose name is Gog and Magog, and who are Huns. Among them is one called Gazari, who are circumcised and observe Judaism in its entirety. This remark occurs a propos of Matthew 24.14, which has no apparent bearing on it, and no more is heard of the subject. About the same time when Druthmar wrote down what he knew from hearsay about the Jewish Khazars, a famed Christian missionary sent by the Byzantine emperor attempted to convert them to Christianity. He was no less a figure than Saint Cyril, apostle of the Slavs, alleged designer of the Cyrillic alphabet. He and his elder brother, Saint Methodus, were entrusted with this and other proselytizing missions by the Emperor Michael III, on the advice of the Patriot Photius, himself apparently of Khazar descent, for it is reported that the emperor once called him, in anger, Khazar Face. Cyril's proselytizing efforts seem to have been successful among the Slavic people in Eastern Europe, but not among the Khazars. He traveled to their country via Kherson in the Crimea. In Kherson, he is said to have spent 6 months learning Hebrew in preparation for his mission. He then took the Khazarian way, the Don-Volga portage, to Ital, and from there traveled along the Caspian to meet the Kagan. It is not said where. The usual theological disputations followed, but they had little impact on the Khazar Jews. Even the adultery Vita Constantine, Cyril's original name, says only that Cyril made a good impression on the Kagan, that a few people were baptized and 200 Christian prisoners were released by the Kagans as a gesture of goodwill. It was the least he could do for the emperor's envoy who had gone to so much trouble. There is a curious sidelight thrown on the story by students of Slavic philology. Cyril is credited by tradition not only with having devised the Cyrillic, but also the Glagolic alphabet. The later, according to Barron, was used in Croatia to the 17th century. Its indebtedness to the Hebrew alphabet in at least 11 characters, representing in part the Slavic sounds, have long been recognized. The 11 characters are A, B, V, G, E, K, P, R, S, Sh, and T. This seems to confirm what has been said earlier on about the influence of the Hebrew alphabet in spreading literacy among the neighbors of the Khazars. Next, decline. Next chapter, decline.